Clarence Graves had been riding fence lines, branding cattle, and hauling hay bales since he was old enough to sit a horse. But the morning he first laid eyes on the new schoolteacher stepping down from the dusty stagecoach in Millhaven, Texas, in the summer of 1882, he lost the ability to do any of those things with any sort of grace whatsoever. He had been leaning against the post of Hanley's feed and grain, arms crossed, hat pulled low, watching the stage roll in the way any man in a small town watches the stage roll in, which is to say with mild interest and nothing more. But then the door swung open, and a slender hand appeared, gloved in soft cream cotton, and the woman who followed that hand into the bright Texas sunlight was the kind of woman that made a man straighten his spine without meaning to. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a modest gray traveling hat, and eyes the color of summer sage when the light hit them just right. She wore a practical navy dress, slightly wrinkled from the long journey, and she carried a leather satchel so stuffed with books and papers that the clasp refused to close properly. She descended the coach steps with dignity despite the weight of that bag and the heat of the Texas midday, and she looked around at Millhaven with an expression that was not disappointment exactly, but the careful, composed face of a woman who had made a decision and intended to live by it regardless of what the world handed her. Clarence had to remind himself to breathe. He was 28 years old that summer, sunburned and broad-shouldered, with dark eyes and hands that showed every year of hard ranch work. He worked the Donnelly spread a mile and a half outside of town, riding for Hector Donnelly, a fair enough man who paid honest wages and expected honest labor. Clarence had been in Millhaven for 3 years by then, having ridden up from San Antonio after a disagreement with his previous employer that had more to do with principle than money. He was known in town as dependable, quiet, and capable of fixing almost anything mechanical or structural that broke down on a ranch. He was not known as a man who lingered in town longer than his errands required. But that afternoon, after he watched Rose Hawkins retrieve her trunk from the top of the stage and ask the driver something with a polite, steady voice that carried clear across the street, Clarence Graves found himself lingering. He watched her introduce herself to Marvella Oates, the mayor's wife, who had come to receive the new teacher. He watched her shake hands and smile in a way that was warm but measured, the smile of a woman who was sizing up her new surroundings with intelligence and care. He watched as Marvella led her toward the schoolhouse on the far end of Main Street, and he watched until the door closed behind them both. Then he turned around, picked up the sack of grain he had come for, loaded it into the wagon bed, and drove back to the Donnelly spread, telling himself he had no particular reason to think about auburn hair and sage-colored eyes for the rest of the evening. He thought about them for the rest of the week. The schoolhouse in Millhaven was a single-room building of whitewashed pine, set back from the main road behind a stand of 3 live oak trees that offered a little shade in the brutal afternoon heat. It had been empty for the better part of 4 months after the previous teacher, a young man named Peabody, had married a girl from Abilene and followed her back to her father's farm. The children of Millhaven had spent those 4 months running considerably wilder than usual, which had caused considerable complaint from their parents, who had written to the county superintendent in Austin and requested a replacement with some urgency. Rose Hawkins had arrived in answer to that urgency, having trained at a normal school in Missouri and taught for 2 years in a small town in Kansas before deciding she wanted to try Texas. What her reasons were for leaving Kansas, she had not shared with anyone in Millhaven yet, though Marvella Oates had already begun making educated guesses and sharing them with anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Clarence did not spend time at the Oates house, and therefore received very little of Marvella's speculation. What he did receive, about 10 days after Rose's arrival, was a gentle suggestion from Hector Donnelly himself. They were sitting on the porch of the ranch house after supper, the way they often did in the cooling evening air, Hector with his pipe and Clarence with a tin cup of coffee, listening to the coyotes start up somewhere off to the east. "I hear tell that Schoolteacher is opening up evening lessons," Hector said, not looking at Clarence, just looking out at the darkening scrub. "For adults, folks who never had proper schooling." Clarence turned his cup in his hands. "Is that so? Arithmetic and reading mostly." "I imagine letters too." Hector drew on his pipe. "Would be a useful thing for a man to know how to manage accounts proper, keep records for a ranch outfit." Clarence was quiet for a moment. He could read. He had taught himself years ago from a Bible and a farmer's almanac, and while his arithmetic was not elegant, he could calculate wages and feed costs well enough to get by. He said none of this. "I suppose it would be useful," he said instead. Hector said nothing more about it, and neither did Clarence. But the next morning, while Clarence was mending a section of broken fence at the eastern edge of the property, he found himself thinking about what it might be like to sit in that whitewashed schoolhouse in the evening, and about whether a man might have legitimate reason to be there even if his reading was, by any honest measure, sufficient for his daily life. He rode into town 3 days later on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly for supplies. He tied his horse at the rail outside Hanley's and walked the length of the main road, not rushing, stopping to exchange a few words with Pete Calloway at the barber shop, and nodding to old Judge Fenwick on his bench outside the post office. He came to the schoolhouse at the far end of the road and stood for a moment under the live oaks, hat in hand, the way a man stands when he is pretending to be casual and is doing a rather poor job of it. Through the window he could see Rose Hawkins at the blackboard, writing in a clear, deliberate hand. She was alone, working in the late afternoon light, and she was wearing a different dress today, a soft brown one, and her hair was looser than it had been on the day she arrived, pinned up but not so severely. She appeared to be drafting a lesson plan, murmuring something to herself as she wrote, and the sight of it, the quiet industry of her, the way she tilted her head slightly when she considered what she had written, struck Clarence somewhere just behind his ribs in a way that was entirely inconvenient. He put his hat back on and knocked on the open door. She turned, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, and then she set down her chalk and wiped her fingers on a small cloth she kept tucked in her apron pocket. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was clear and had a quality to it that made you feel she actually meant the question. "I heard you were offering evening lessons," Clarence said, stepping into the doorway but not quite through it, holding his hat in both hands now, "for adults who might benefit from some help with reading and accounts." She studied him with those sage-colored eyes. There was a directness to her gaze that was neither impolite nor particularly warm. It was simply honest. "I am," she said. "I was planning to begin next Tuesday." "Are you looking to improve your reading, or is it the arithmetic that you find troubling?" Clarence considered lying entirely and decided against it. What he did instead was choose the particular truth that was most convenient. "Both," he said. "I have a fair general sense of things, but when it comes to keeping proper books for a ranch operation, I find myself in some difficulty." This last part was true enough. He did not keep the books for the Donnelly spread, and had he been asked to, he might have managed, but he would not have done it elegantly. "Ranch books," she said, as if filing this information away. "Very well. I can address that. What is your name?" "Clarence Graves." "I work for Hector Donnelly, out past the East Fork of Comanche Creek." She nodded. "Miss Rose Hawkins," she said, extending her hand in the businesslike way she had, the same way he'd watched her extend it to Marvella Oates. "Lessons are on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, 7 until 9. You are welcome to come." He shook her hand. It was a brief handshake, correct and professional, but her fingers were warm and steady, and Clarence held on 1/2 second longer than was strictly necessary before he let go. "Thank you," he said. "I will be there." He walked back to Hanley's, collected his supplies, and rode back to the Donnelly spread in the long gold light of the Texas evening. feeling considerably better about the world than he had in some time, and feeling, at the same time, the particular low-level guilt of a man who has not exactly lied but has not exactly been straightforward either. Tuesday arrived with the slow weight of a summer week. Clarence spent the day doing the kind of ranch work that fills the body completely and leaves just enough space in the mind for distraction to creep in. He replaced a rotted board in the horse barn, helped the Donnellys' hand, a young man named Armando Reyes, work a green-broke gelding in the round pen, and spent the hot middle of the afternoon re-rigging a windmill pump that had been sticking for a week. Through all of it, he found himself checking the angle of the sun with more frequency than the actual work required. He changed into his better shirt at 6:30, a dark blue one with no visible mend marks, and brushed his hat and rode the 1.5 miles into town at an unhurried pace that fooled no one, least of all himself. There were 4 other students already seated at the children's desks when he arrived, which he had not entirely anticipated. The desks were small, and he had to arrange himself with some care to fit his frame into one, folding his long legs to the side in a way that was not dignified but was functional. There was a woman of perhaps 40 named Greta Mossman who, Clarence knew by sight, worked at the laundry on Pine Street. There was a Mexican vaquero named Santos who worked a neighboring ranch, and a pair of young brothers named Elias and Dade Potts who had come in from their father's farm looking slightly anxious and smelling of wood smoke. Rose came in precisely at 7, carrying a stack of primers and a ledger book. She wore a dark green dress with a high collar, and her hair was up in a neat roll at the back of her neck. She moved with purpose, setting her materials on the desk at the front of the room, and she looked at each of them in turn with that same level, honest gaze. "Good evening," she said. "I am glad you are all here. Let me be clear about what these lessons will be and what they will not be. You are adults, and I will treat you as such. There is nothing shameful in seeking knowledge at any point in a person's life, and anyone who tells you differently has confused pride for wisdom." She paused to let this settle. "We will work at whatever pace serves you best, and if something is not clear, I expect you to say so. Questions are not a sign of failing. They are a sign of thinking." Clarence watched her from his small desk, and thought that he had never heard an educator speak in quite that way, with such directness, and without any of the condescension that so often seemed to accompany the offering of instruction to grown people who had not had formal schooling. That first evening, she worked with each student individually for a period, moving from desk to desk with patient attention. When she came to Clarence, she pulled up the chair from the neighboring desk and sat beside him and asked him to show her, using the ledger she had brought, how he currently managed figures. Clarence produced the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, a real notebook, one he actually used to record minor expenses and measurements, and she studied it for a moment. He watched her face as she read through his rough columns of numbers and abbreviated notes. She was very close to him, the closest she had been, close enough that he could detect the faint scent of lavender soap and chalk dust, and he made a serious effort to focus on the notebook rather than on the fact of her proximity. "Your instincts are sound," she said, handing it back. "Your columns are consistent and your arithmetic is accurate. What you lack is system. If you were keeping proper ranch books with income and expenditure and stock records, you would need a more organized framework." She opened the ledger book and showed him a simple double-column format. "See how this works? Everything has its place. Nothing is lost." "Everything in its place," he repeated, not because he did not understand, but because he was struck by the quiet conviction with which she said it. She glanced at him, a quick sideways look that was almost amused. "Precisely," she said, and moved on to Santos at the next desk. He came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. By the end of the first month, he had settled into what he told himself was a routine, and what was in fact something rather more deliberate. He came early enough each time to arrange the chairs and sweep the floor if it needed it, which it usually did. since the daytime children had a tendency to scatter dirt and chalk fragments with impressive enthusiasm. He stayed after the lesson ended to help carry the lamp and make sure the windows were latched against the evening wind. Rose accepted these small assistances with the same level politeness she applied to everything, thanking him, and then turning to the next task with the efficient economy of motion that was simply how she moved through the world. But there were moments. Small ones, the kind that accumulate in a person without their entirely noticing, the way water fills a barrel one slow drip at a time. One Thursday evening in September, the other students had all gone home and Clarence was returning the desks to their proper rows, and Rose was erasing the blackboard, and a thunderstorm came up fast the way Texas storms do, without much warning, rolling in over the darkened plain like a fist. The rain hit the roof of the schoolhouse in a sudden roar and lightning lit up the windows, and Rose, who had been reaching up to erase the top of the board, startled and dropped her eraser. Clarence picked it up and handed it to her without thinking, and she took it and laughed. A real laugh, not the polite smile she usually offered, but an actual startled laugh at herself for flinching at thunder. "I grew up in Missouri," she said, recovering herself, "and I have been in a dozen storms worse than this one, and yet every single time," she shook her head. "They hit faster out here," Clarence said. "You get used to the look of them eventually, the color the sky goes beforehand. But the sound of it on a tin roof will always put your heart in your throat. I don't care how long you've lived in Texas." She looked at him for a moment, and the lamplight was warm and the rain was very loud, and there was something different about the quality of the silence between one sentence and the next. "How long have you lived in Texas?" she asked. 3 years in Millhaven. Before that, San Antonio, and before that, a cattle drive up from the Rio Grande country that took the better part of 6 months and is a story for another time. "I would like to hear it," she said, and he did not think she was simply being polite. The storm kept them there another 40 minutes, talking by the light of the lamp, rain drumming on the roof and lightning walking across the plain outside. She told him about Missouri, about the town she had grown up in, a river town that had been something before the war and something else after, changed in ways that the people who lived there could not quite make sense of. She told him about the normal school, about the teachers who had shaped her, and the ones who had simply occupied space. She told him about Kansas, and she said it with a careful neutrality that made him understand there was something there she had decided not to elaborate on, and he did not press her. He told her about the cattle drive and about San Antonio, and about the way the Texas Hill Country looked in spring when the bluebonnets came in, and she listened with the kind of attention that was its own form of compliment. When the rain eased enough to ride, they walked out together under the live oaks and parted ways with a good evening and nothing more. But Clarence rode home in the wet dark feeling as though something had shifted on its axis slightly. The way a door that has been sitting crooked in its frame will settle after a good rain and hang true for the first time. October came with the first real cool, the edge going out of the nights, and the sky turning that particular deep blue that only happens in Texas autumn. The Donnelly spread was in the thick of the fall roundup, which meant long days and very little leisure, and Clarence found himself working from first light until the stars were well up, falling into his bunk in the bunkhouse he shared with Armando Reyes and a man named Colt Ferguson who snored like a freight engine. He did not miss a single Tuesday or Thursday lesson. He invented reasons. He told himself he was developing a genuine facility for bookkeeping, which was not entirely untrue, because Rose was a good teacher and he was a diligent student even under false pretenses, and by October his record-keeping had improved substantially. He had begun maintaining a proper ledger for his own wages and personal accounts, and he had taken it upon himself to offer to help Hector Donnelly reorganize the ranch records, which Hector accepted with the pleased surprise of a man who has expected nothing and received something useful. But the real reason he came, every Tuesday and Thursday without exception, was Rose Hawkins. He watched the way she thought, the way she paused before answering a difficult question, not from uncertainty, but from a genuine desire to give the most accurate answer she could. He watched the way she treated Santos and Greta and the Potts brothers, with the same careful respect she gave him, without any of the casual diminishment that so many people of her education and station applied to those they considered below them. She took each person at the value of their attention and their effort, and it was a quality Clarence found, the longer he knew her, to be one of the rarest he had ever encountered. He was also, by October, beginning to feel the considerable weight of his own deception, small as it was. It came to a head one Tuesday evening when Greta Mossman, who had been making tremendous progress and who had a mind like a steel trap once you gave her the key to something, sat back in her desk with a satisfied expression after completing a long addition problem and said to the room at large, "You know, I thought coming to these lessons would make me feel foolish, but I don't. I feel like myself, only with more tools." Rose smiled at her warmly. "That is exactly what education ought to do," she said. Then she looked around the room. "I think all of you have made remarkable progress. When I think about where you each started," she glanced at Clarence. "Mr. Graves, I believe you came here 6 weeks ago saying you had considerable difficulty with ranch accounts." "I did say that," Clarence agreed, keeping his face neutral. "And yet last Thursday you showed me a complete ledger organized by category that most trained bookkeepers would find no fault with." Her tone was not accusatory. It was simply precise. "I find myself wondering whether you perhaps undersold your abilities at the outset." The room was quiet. Santos looked at the ceiling. The Potts brothers exchanged a look. Greta Mossman watched with frank interest. "I may have," Clarence said, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had said in 6 weeks, and also the most incomplete. Rose studied him for a moment with those sage-colored eyes, and he could not read exactly what she saw, which was unusual for him because he was generally a decent reader of people. Then she turned back to the lesson and did not mention it again that evening. After the others had gone, while Clarence was straightening the desks, he heard her at the board behind him and then heard her stop, and he turned to find her looking at him with a different expression than her usual teaching face. It was not angry exactly. It was considering. "Why did you really come, Mr. Graves?" she asked. He put down the chair he was holding and stood for a moment in the lamplight, and he made a decision in the way that men like him make decisions, which is to simply say the thing and let it land where it lands. "Because I wanted to spend time near you," he said, "and I knew that was not a thing I could simply say to a woman I had just met in the street, so I used the books as a reason." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds Clarence could remember. "That is a remarkably honest answer," she said finally. "It seemed like the least I owed you, given the dishonest beginning." She turned her chalk over in her fingers once, then set it down on the ledge. "You have put me in an unusual position," she said. "I am the teacher. I have a responsibility to this town and to my students and a reputation that I must maintain carefully. I cannot afford to be the subject of gossip." "I understand that," he said. "I am not asking you for anything improper. I am asking whether there might be a proper way to spend time in your company that would not compromise your position." He paused. "And whether you might want that." The lamp guttered slightly in a draft from the window. He had not quite latched properly. Rose looked at the lamp and then at Clarence and then at some middle point between them, thinking with that careful deliberateness that was so characteristic of her. "I take a walk on Sunday mornings," she said, "when the weather permits, on the road that runs along the creek south of town. I leave after church." Another pause, measured and precise. "It is a public road." "It is," Clarence agreed. "Good evening, Mr. Graves," she said, and picked up her chalk again. "Good evening, Miss Hawkins," he said, and put on his hat and went out into the cool October night feeling as though the stars were considerably closer than they usually were. That Sunday, he attended the First Methodist Church of Millhaven for the first time in his 3 years in town. which caused Hector Donnelly to raise his eyebrows when he mentioned it at breakfast, and caused Armando Reyes to grin in a knowing way that Clarence chose to ignore entirely. He sat in the back pew and watched Rose Hawkins sing hymns 3 rows ahead of him with a clear, unself-conscious voice, and he thought that whatever he had started the first moment he'd watched her step off that stagecoach was not going to be easily or willingly undone. After the service, he walked south along the creek road in the mild October morning, hands in his coat pockets, moving at a pace that was unhurried but deliberate. He had been walking about 20 minutes when he heard footsteps behind him on the packed dirt road and turned to see Rose, in a dark red coat he had not seen before, catching up with a straight-backed, purposeful stride that also somehow managed to convey the impression that she was simply going for a walk and had not particularly planned to find anyone on this road. "Mr. Graves," she said. "Miss Hawkins," he replied, falling into step beside her. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the creek murmuring to their left through stands of cottonwood, a couple of kingfishers working the shallow water, the morning air smelling of mud and cedar. It was a good silence, comfortable in the way that silences only are between people who are beginning to know each other. "May I ask you something?" Rose said eventually. "Yes. You said you left San Antonio because of a disagreement with your employer. What sort of disagreement?" He considered the question and gave it a straight answer. He was a rancher named Elias Dutton, and he had a habit of underpaying the Mexican hands who worked for him, not by accident, by intention. I spoke to him about it and he told me it was his business and not mine. When I paid the difference out of my own wages and left, he tried to claim I had stolen from him. Clarence looked out at the creek. Nothing came of the claim, but it seemed like a good time to find a different part of Texas. Rose was quiet for a moment. "That was a righteous thing to do," she said, "and also an expensive one. Most righteous things are." She glanced at him with something that was not quite a smile but was in that neighborhood. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure. The men who have expressed interest in me since I arrived in Millhaven have generally been either very obvious about it or very clumsy, or both." She looked ahead at the road. "You were certainly not clumsy. I was not entirely honest either." "No," she agreed, "but you were honest when it mattered." A pause. "I appreciate that." They walked another mile along the creek road, talking the way people talk when they are trying to take the measure of each other, carefully and with interest. And when Rose turned back at a particular bend in the road she seemed to have marked as her turning point, they walked back together and parted at the edge of town with the same correct formality they maintained in the schoolhouse. But there was a difference in it now, a mutual acknowledgement of something, and Clarence Graves rode back to the Donnelly spread in the October sunshine, feeling that the world was a considerably finer place than he had previously understood it to be. He still came to the lessons on Tuesday and Thursday. He no longer pretended to need help with the books. What he did instead was offer to help Rose with the preparations and the clearing up, which she accepted without making a fuss about it, and which gave them the companionable 15 or 20 minutes before the other students arrived and after they left. Santos had noticed and said nothing, which Clarence appreciated. Greta Mossman had also noticed, and had expressed her feelings on the subject by periodically appearing to need assistance with a problem at the precise moment Clarence was standing near Rose's desk, forcing him to step away, which made Greta smile in a way that reminded Clarence of a well-fed cat. November came in cold and windy, the prairie grass going the color of old straw and the pecans dropping from the trees along the creek. Clarence had been in Millhaven long enough to know what kind of winter was coming, a hard one. You could tell by the thickness of the woolly bear caterpillars and the early geese going over in long, ragged lines. On a Thursday evening in the second week of November, he arrived at the schoolhouse to find Rose already there, but not preparing the lesson. She was sitting at her desk with her hands folded on top of it and an expression on her face that he had not seen before, something controlled and a little tired in a way that went deeper than just the end of a long teaching day. He set the lamp on the desk and sat down in his usual small chair without saying anything, waiting. "I had a letter today," she said eventually. "From my mother." He waited. "She is unwell. She has been unwell for some time, but it has worsened." She looked at her folded hands. "She is in Missouri and I am here, and there is a great deal of distance between those two facts." "Does she have people with her?" Clarence asked. "Other family?" "My aunt." "They are together, which is something." Rose let out a careful breath. "I chose to come here knowing the distance. I cannot undo that choice, and I would not, because the children here needed a teacher and I am a teacher. But there are moments when the rightness of a thing and the difficulty of it exist very clearly at the same time." "Yes," Clarence said simply, because he had had his own version of that feeling, and he knew that what she needed was not reassurance or advice but simply to be heard. She looked up at him. "You are easy to talk to," she said, and there was something slightly surprised in it, as if she had not expected to find that true. "I try not to make it difficult," he said. She almost smiled. Then she straightened, the slight tiredness pulling back, and she picked up her chalk and said, "I should prepare the board," and he stood and moved the desks into their proper configuration, and neither of them said anything more about the letter. But the shape of the evening was different for it, warmer and more honest. The way a room feels different after someone has opened a window for a moment and let the outside air in. The other students arrived, and the lesson proceeded, and it was not until the very end, while Clarence was banking the stove for the night, that Rose said quietly, "Thank you for listening earlier." "Any time," he said, and meant it with the full weight of the word. December arrived and brought with it the peculiar social mathematics of a small Texas town approaching Christmas, which meant church socials and various informal gatherings, and an increased tendency for people to involve themselves in each other's business with the excuse of the season. Marvella Oates organized a potluck supper at the church hall to which everyone in Millhaven was expected to come, and at which Marvella herself engineered the seating arrangement with a strategic transparency that she seemed entirely unaware of, placing Clarence 2 seats down from Rose with only old Judge Fenwick between them, and looking pleased with herself about it in a way that told Clarence she had known about his Tuesday and Thursday attendance at the schoolhouse for considerably longer than he had imagined. He sat through the supper making conversation with the judge, who was a dry and shrewd man with an extensive memory for the legal disasters that had befallen various citizens of Millhaven over the years, and periodically catching Rose's eye across the intervening space. She was talking to Greta Mossman on her right and seemed genuinely engaged in the conversation. But once, when Marvella leaned over to refill her glass and blocked the sightlane between them for a moment, Clarence caught the edge of a look Rose sent his way that was dry and wry and entirely complicit, the look of someone sharing a private joke. He ducked his head to hide the size of his smile and concentrated on his plate. After the supper, when the tables were being pushed back for the dancing that always followed these events, he found Rose standing near the door talking to the Reverend Caldwell, who was a well-meaning man with a habit of conducting conversations for considerably longer than the subject matter required. Clarence waited until the Reverend was intercepted by a deacon with a question about the Christmas program, and then he was simply standing beside Rose and she was simply standing beside him, and neither of them had particularly arranged it. "Are you a dancing man, Mr. Graves?" she asked. "When the occasion calls for it," he said. "Are you a dancing woman, Miss Hawkins?" "I have been known to be," she said, which was about as clear an invitation as Rose Hawkins was likely to offer in the middle of a church hall in front of the entire town of Millhaven. He danced with her twice, which was, by 1882 social convention, somewhere between polite and notable. They danced to a reel first, which required little contact and considerable agility, and then to a slower waltz tune that Pete Calloway sought out on his fiddle with more enthusiasm than technique. The waltz put his hand on her waist and her hand on his shoulder, and they moved together with a naturalness that surprised him pleasantly, the way two people who are in easy sympathy with each other will often move well together even without practice. "You dance well," she said. "My mother taught me," he said. "She said no son of hers was going to shuffle around at a party like a man trying to escape a mud hole." She laughed, the real one, the one that escaped before she could decide whether to let it out, and Clarence thought he would spend a considerable amount of effort for the rest of his life trying to earn that laugh. After the dancing, he walked her to the house where she boarded, a room at the widow Calloway's place on the near end of Main Street. They stood on the porch for a few minutes in the cold December air, their breath making small clouds, the stars very clear and bright the way they get in a cold Texas night. "I want to say something," Clarence said, "and I want to say it clearly so there is no ambiguity." Rose looked at him steadily. "All right. I would very much like to court you properly," he said. "With your full knowledge and your full consent, and conduct it entirely in the open, so that there is no damage to your reputation or your standing in this town. I am not a man of significant means, but I am steady and I am honest, apart from one initial use of bookkeeping as a pretense which I have already accounted for and which I believe you have already forgiven me for." A pause. "The cold air, the stars. That is a very organized way to declare an interest," she said. "I have been learning about keeping proper records," he said. "Everything in its place." This time the laugh came first and the smile followed it, and she looked at him in the starlight with her sage-colored eyes and said, "Yes, Clarence, you may court me properly." He rode home that night unable to feel the cold at all. What followed was a courtship conducted with the particular care of two serious people, who understood that what they were building was real, and that real things required care. He came to Sunday walks on the creek road when the weather allowed, and to the church social when it occurred, and he sent her a small Christmas gift through the post, a volume of Texas wildflower illustrations that he had ordered from a shop in Austin, which required more planning and forethought than he generally applied to gift-giving, but which seemed, when she received it, to have been exactly the right thing. She sent him a note thanking him for it, and the note was 3 sentences, but the handwriting was very careful, and the 3 sentences were warm in a way that 3 sentences had not previously managed to be in Clarence's experience. January came hard, the way the hard winters came, ice on the stock tanks, and a north wind that cut right through everything. The evening lessons continued through the cold, though Greta and the Potts brothers came less consistently, the farm people having trouble traveling in the worst of the weather. Santos remained a faithful attendee, as did Clarence, and on the coldest evenings it was often just the 3 of them in the schoolhouse, with the stove going full bore and the windows rattling in the wind. One such evening, when Santos had left early because his horse had thrown a shoe and he wanted to get back before the road froze harder, Clarence and Rose were alone in the schoolhouse again, and the wind was making a sound outside that was somewhere between a moan and a shout, and Rose had been quieter than usual all evening, not distracted exactly, but with the particular inward quality she got when something was sitting on her mind. He asked about it directly because he had learned that with Rose, directness was always the right approach. "My mother," she said. "Another letter. She is not getting better." He put down the lamp chimney he had been polishing and looked at her. "I have been thinking," she said, in the careful way she had when she was working out something difficult, "about whether I should go back." The word "back" settled in the cold air of the schoolhouse, and Clarence heard everything it contained. "What is stopping you?" He asked because he wanted to know what she was weighing, and he did not want to be the thing that weighed on the wrong side without her knowing it. She looked at him. "Millhaven needs a teacher," she said, and she stopped, and he said quietly, "There are things here I did not expect to find," she said, which was as close as Rose Hawkins came at that point to saying what he thought she might be saying. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When does she need you?" "Soon," Rose said. "My aunt has written to say she cannot manage alone through the winter." "Then you should go," Clarence said. It cost him something to say it, and he did not hide that entirely, but he said it because it was true. A woman's mother takes precedence over a teaching post, and she takes precedence over. He paused. Over whatever this is. Rose looked at him with the expression she got when someone had said something that landed exactly where it was meant to. "You are a good man, Clarence Graves," she said softly. "Write to me while you're there," he said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," she said. She left Millhaven on the 10th of February on the northbound stage, with her trunk and her satchel and the wildflower book tucked under her arm, and Clarence was there at the stage stop to see her off along with half the town and Marvella Oates, who cried in an operatic way and pressed a tin of cookies into Rose's hands. Rose shook hands with the other students. She embraced Greta Mossman. She said a warm goodbye to Santos in both English and what Spanish she had picked up, and then she stood in front of Clarence, and they looked at each other in the cold February morning with the stage driver up top calling for passengers to board. "I intend to come back," she said. "I want you to know that." "I know it," he said. He took her hand and held it for a moment the way he had that very first evening in the schoolhouse, 1/2 second longer than propriety strictly required. "Take care of your mother. Take care of the ledger," she said, a small private reference that made him almost smile. Then she was up the steps and the door closed and the stage rolled away north through the February morning, and Clarence stood watching it until it disappeared around the long curve of the road, and then he stood watching the empty road for a moment after that, because that is what a man does. The letters began arriving in March. The first one was measured and informative, telling him about the journey and about Missouri and about her mother's condition, which was serious but not immediately desperate. The handwriting was neat and controlled. It was the letter of a woman who was being careful. By April the letters were longer and the handwriting was the same, but the tone had changed slightly, or had relaxed slightly, the careful containment of it giving way at the edges. She told him about Missouri in a way that was not just informative but evocative, about the smell of the river in spring, and the particular sound of trains in a town that was built around a railway junction, and the way her mother's voice had been before she was unwell and was, occasionally, still. He wrote back. Writing had never been a natural thing for him, and his early letters were shorter than hers and more plainly constructed, but he wrote them with all the care he had, and he told her about the Texas spring, about the bluebonnets he had mentioned to her in the schoolhouse all those months ago, covering the slopes out south of town like a blue cloth laid out in the sunlight, and about the Donnelly spread getting ready for the spring drive, and about Santos passing his reading assessment which Rose had given him before she left, Santos reading aloud from the county newspaper with a straight back and a grave expression, and then grinning enormously when he finished. He told her he missed the Sunday walks. He told her he missed the Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He told her these things plainly, because he had learned from watching Rose that plainness was usually better than elaboration when it came to things that mattered. May brought a letter that had a different quality to it than the previous ones, something more open, less controlled. Her mother had had a good week, the first in several months, and Rose had gone walking along the river alone in the warm May afternoon, and had found herself thinking about Texas, and had written to him from a bench on the riverbank with the letter resting on the wildflower book, and there was a water stain in the lower left corner of the page where she had set the paper on the damp wood. He kept every letter in the box under his bunk on the Donnelly spread, and sometimes in the evenings when the work was done, and Armando was asleep, and Colt Ferguson was producing his nightly freight train sounds, Clarence read them by the light of a small candle, and felt the extraordinary and slightly uncomfortable fullness of a man who has something to lose. June brought a letter that said her mother was stronger, and that the doctor was cautiously hopeful, and that her aunt seemed to have found her footing in the caretaking, and that Rose was beginning to think about when she might return to Millhaven. She said the county superintendent had written to ask whether he should seek a permanent replacement for the fall, and that she had told him She intended to return by August if her mother's condition permitted. Clarence wrote back the same day he received that letter. His reply was the longest he had written. He told her about the ranch and the spring in Santos, as he usually did, and then he wrote a paragraph at the end that he drafted 3 times on scraps of paper before he transferred it to the good sheet. And what it said, in the best plain language he could manage, was that he thought about her every day and that Millhaven was a fine town, but it was considerably better when she was in it, and that if she returned he intended to continue his courtship with the intention, if she was willing, of making it something more permanent, and that she should take whatever time she needed and he would be here. He sent the letter, and then went out and worked the rest of the day with the kind of focused physical exertion that is the best remedy for having made yourself thoroughly vulnerable on paper to another person. Her reply took 3 weeks, which was long enough for him to go through several distinct periods of self-recrimination, and one very dark Tuesday evening of wondering whether he had misjudged everything. Then the letter arrived, and he sat in the dim bunkhouse in the July heat with Armando diplomatically absent and read it twice. She said she had read his letter several times. She said she had thought about it carefully, which was how she thought about everything, and that she found herself in agreement with what he had said about Millhaven being better when she was in it, because she found herself feeling something similar in reverse, and that she intended to return in August as planned, and that she was looking forward to their continued acquaintance with a great deal more than the usual anticipation one brings to a resumed professional relationship. It was perhaps the most warm and forthright love letter in history to have used the phrase, continued acquaintance. Clarence folded it and put it in the box and went out into the July evening and looked at the stars and felt the kind of happiness that is almost frightening in its size. August arrived, and with it, the letter that said she was coming back on the 23rd, on the southbound stage that arrived in Millhaven at midday. Clarence told Hector Donnelly he needed a morning off. Hector said, of course, and Armando nodded without being told what it was for, because Armando was 22 years old and had excellent instincts. The stage came in at 12:05 on a hot August Thursday, dusty and slightly late, and Clarence was standing under the live oaks beside the stage stop with his hat in his hands. And when the door opened and Rose Hawkins came down the steps into the bright Texas noon, she was wearing the dark red coat she had been wearing on their first Sunday walk along the creek, which seemed to him a very deliberate choice. And she saw him immediately and stopped at the foot of the steps and looked at him with those sage-colored eyes. She looked different and the same, more settled somehow, or more certain. There was something in her face that had been shaped by the months away, a more visible depth to her, and she looked at him without any of the careful measured quality she had always maintained before, just directly, the way the light comes in through an east window in the morning. "You are here," she said. "I told you I would be," he said. She crossed to him, and he took her hand, and they stood for a moment in the August heat under the live oaks, while the stage driver unloaded the trunk, and the rest of Millhaven went about its business entirely unsuccessfully pretending not to observe what was happening between the cowboy and the schoolteacher. "It is very good to be back," she said. "It is very good that you are," he said. They did not embrace in the street, because Rose was Rose and that was not how she managed herself in public, but she kept hold of his hand for a moment longer than a handshake required before she released it, and that was enough. The evening lessons resumed in September, with a fresh set of adult students in addition to Santos, who had come back because he said he had more to learn, and who Clarence suspected came back partly for the same reason Clarence himself had come in the first place, because the schoolhouse in the evening was a good place to be. Rose had brought back from Missouri 2 new primers and a comprehensive arithmetic text she had found in a bookshop in the river town, and she attacked the fall term with a renewed energy that Clarence thought had something to do with having been away and choosing to return, with the clarity that sometimes comes from distance. He continued to come early and stay late, and to walk her back to the widow Calloway's house on the nights when the other students had gone. These walks were the best part of his week. They talked about everything, the ranch and the school and the children Rose was teaching during the days, about books and about the country, and about what they had each thought and seen and noticed since they had last spoken. He had learned that Rose had strong opinions about political questions, about the treatment of the Mexican communities along the border, about the reservation system, and what it had done to the Apache and Comanche peoples who had lived on this land before it became a network of ranches and cattle trails. She expressed these opinions without heat but without apology, and Clarence, who had his own sense of what was fair and what was not, found he agreed with her more often than not, and on the occasions he did not, their disagreements were the interesting kind, the kind that made him think. "You should have been a lawyer," he told her once on one of these walks. "No," she said, "I should have been a teacher, which I am, but had I been a man, perhaps." "It is not a fair arrangement," he said. "No," she agreed. "It is not. But I have found it is possible to do a great deal within an unfair arrangement if you are strategic about where you place your energies." She paused. "The children I teach, the girls especially, some of what I can give them is knowledge. Some of it is the simple fact that I am here, that a woman chose a professional life and is living it, and that is visible to them every day." He looked at her in the evening light of the October street and thought that there were very few people in his life who had made him feel, in their presence, that the world was a larger and more interesting place than he had previously understood. His mother had been one. Rose Hawkins was another. October passed and November came, and on a cold Saturday afternoon when the ranch was quiet, and the sky was the color of pewter and the pecan trees along the creek were fully bare, Clarence Graves rode into Millhaven with something in his inside breast pocket that had been there for 2 weeks because he had been working up to this, and had decided that continuing to work up to it was beginning to make him ridiculous. He tied his horse at the rail outside the widow Calloway's and knocked on the door, and the widow, who was a sharp-eyed woman of 60 who missed nothing, let him in with a look that suggested she had been expecting this particular call for some time. Rose came down from her room in a few minutes in her everyday dark green dress, and she saw his face and she paused on the bottom step. "Sit down, Rose," he said, and the use of her given name, which he only used in private, told her something was different about this. She sat down in the widow's parlor, and the widow made herself absent in the way that experienced women make themselves absent, and Clarence sat in the chair across from Rose and looked at her for a moment because he had learned that some things deserved a moment before you came to them. "I have been thinking about this for a long time," he said, "and I want to say it right." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his hat in his hands, looking at her the way he had looked at her the first evening in the schoolhouse when she had asked him what he was there for. "I love you, Rose. I have been making my way towards saying that since the day you stepped off that stage and I lost all capability for ordinary function. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I do not mean remarkable in the way that gets said to people to flatter them. I mean it in the actual sense, that you are worthy of remark, that you are notable and exceptional, and that every conversation I have ever had with you has left me thinking about something I had not thought about before." She was very still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on his face. "I am not a wealthy man," he continued, "and I do not have a lot to offer you in terms of material things. I have steady work and the respect of the people I work for, and I have a piece of land northeast of town that I have been paying on for the past 18 months that has a creek running through it, and a stand of live oaks and room for a house. And I am asking whether you would be willing to become my wife, and whether you think you could be happy in a life shared with me." From the back of the house came the sound of something being set down with perhaps slightly more force than was necessary, which indicated that the widow Calloway was listening with considerable attention. Rose looked at him for a long moment in the pewter November light of the parlor, and then she said, I have loved you since September of last year. And the clarity of it, the simple, direct completeness of it, hit him square in the chest. I have been waiting for you to arrive at this point, because I knew you would and I knew you would do it properly, and I did not want to spoil that for you. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. September of last year, she said again, as if the specificity gave her satisfaction. When you told me a man who pays for the dignity of others out of his own wages is a man worth knowing. He stared at her. That was our third Sunday walk, he said. Yes, she said. I know when it was. She looked at him with all the warmth she had always had in reserve, none of the careful measured quality now, all of it present and visible and real. Yes, Clarence, I will marry you. The widow Calloway, from the direction of the kitchen, made a sound that was consistent with a woman who has been proven right about something she was very confident in and is taking appropriate satisfaction in the outcome. They were married in the First Methodist Church of Millhaven on the 15th of December, 1883, which was a Saturday, cold and clear, the sky a brilliant blue above the bare pecan trees and the live oaks holding their few remaining leaves, gold-brown against the blue. The church was full, because Millhaven was a small town, and the wedding of the schoolteacher and the cowboy from the Donnelly spread was an event of considerable community interest. Marvella Oates organized the flowers and cried so enthusiastically, and so early in the ceremony that she had used all her handkerchiefs before the vows. Hector Donnelly sat in the front pew with his wife Clara, and had the expression of a man who is not going to cry and is concentrating hard on that. Armando Reyes was in his best shirt, which he had pressed with visible effort. Santos was there in a good jacket with his wife Catalina, who had come down from Lubbock for the occasion. Greta Mossman had made the cake, a three-tier affair with white icing that she carried into the church hall herself and refused to let anyone else near. Rose came down the aisle in a dress of ivory wool trimmed with the smallest imaginable flowers in pale blue thread, her hair down except for the loose braiding at the crown that was held with the pearl-tipped pins that had been her mother's, mailed down from Missouri along with a letter in her mother's still careful hand that said simply, "He sounds like a good man. Be happy." Clarence stood at the altar in a dark suit he had bought in Abilene for the occasion, and had been extremely careful not to get any ranch dirt on in the intervening 6 days. And when Rose came to stand beside him, he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with that full, careful attention that was one of the things she had noticed first and kept. And she took his hand and they stood together in the cold December church, and said what people say when they mean it absolutely. They moved into the house on the land northeast of town in the spring of 1884. Clarence had spent the winter building it with help from Hector Donnelly and Armando and Santos on 3 successive weekends. A proper 2-room house of local limestone with a real wooden floor and a covered porch facing east to catch the morning light. It was small by some measures and large by others, and Rose walked through it on the first morning they slept there, and touched the walls and the window frames and the wide limestone sill, where she immediately said she planned to keep plants, and she looked at Clarence with an expression that was happiness in its full and uncomplicated form. She continued to teach at the Millhaven schoolhouse. She had made this a condition, and Clarence had agreed to it without reservation, because it was plainly the right thing, and also because he had no interest in marrying a woman who was everything she was, and then asking her to be less. The county superintendent had had a brief concern about whether a married woman could continue in the teaching post, a concern that was common in that era, and that Rose addressed in a letter of such precise and compelling logic that the superintendent, who was a reasonable man, decided the issue in her favor and moved on to other business. Clarence left the Donnelly spread in the summer of 1884 and began working his own land. The piece of property was 40 acres with good grass and the creek through it, and he built up a small cattle operation over the next 2 years with the same steady industry he brought to everything. Hector Donnelly gave him 3 bred heifers as a wedding gift, and the practical sense to go with them. And by the end of 1885, the Graves place had a small but legitimate herd and a reputation for well-kept fences and honest dealing. Rose's mother made a recovery significant enough by the summer of 1884 that she was able to travel, and she came to Texas in September of that year, making the journey with Rose's aunt in a series of stages that took the better part of 10 days. She was a small, silver-haired woman named Eleanor who had Rose's precision of speech and a slightly sharper sense of humor than her daughter, who had learned to moderate hers in the professional context. Eleanor Hawkins looked at the limestone house and the live oaks and the creek in Clarence Graves standing on the porch of his own land and said, "Well, Rose, I see you found something worth staying for," which was, from Eleanor Hawkins, the equivalent of an effusive endorsement. Clarence and Eleanor got along extremely well, which did not surprise Rose but pleased her enormously. Eleanor had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them, and Clarence, who had never been made uncomfortable by a woman with opinions, found her excellent company. She sat on the porch in the September evenings and made observations about Texas with the focused interest of a traveler who has arrived somewhere genuinely foreign, and Clarence answered her questions about the land and the cattle and the country with the patient detail of a man who loves the place he lives and is glad to explain it. Eleanor and the aunt stayed 6 weeks and went home to Missouri in October, and Eleanor said goodbye to Clarence with a handshake that turned into a brief tight embrace that surprised them both and then made them both laugh. The following spring, in April of 1885, Rose told Clarence one morning over the breakfast she was making on their proper cast-iron cookstove that she was expecting a child. She told him in the matter-of-fact way she had of delivering important information, looking at the stove rather than at him. And when he did not immediately respond, she turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes with an expression on his face that she later told Greta Mossman was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. A wide-open amazement like a man who has received something he was afraid to want too directly. He crossed the kitchen and put his hands gently on her face and kissed her forehead and then her hair, and then the bridge of her nose, and she laughed, and he held her very carefully, the way you hold something important. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said, which was not entirely true because the mornings had been difficult for 3 weeks, but was true enough in the sense she meant it. "Stop looking at me like I might break." "I am not looking at you like you might break," he said. "I am looking at you like I am very aware of how fortunate I am." "That is a better description," she said, and turned back to the stove. Their son was born in November of 1885, in the limestone house with the midwife Mrs. Appleyard and Greta Mossman both present. And Greta made herself indispensable in a crisis in the way that large-hearted and capable women always do. Clarence waited on the porch through the long hours of that November night, and when Mrs. Appleyard appeared in the doorway and said, "You have a son," he stood up from the porch step where he had been sitting and said, "And Rose," with the particular directness of a man who wants the real answer and not the reassuring one. "Mrs. Graves is strong and well and asking for you," Mrs. Appleyard said. He went in and sat on the edge of the bed where Rose lay tired but entirely herself, and she placed in his arms a small red-faced boy who was making the furious, affronted expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere rather cold and bright and has opinions about it. "He looks like he has a lot to say," Clarence said. "He will be a Hawkins in that respect," Rose said, slightly hoarse, entirely dignified, watching Clarence hold their son with an expression that Clarence did not see because he was looking at the baby, but which Greta Mossman, from her position near the window, committed to permanent memory as one of the finest things she had ever witnessed. They named him James Henry Graves, James for Clarence's father and Henry for no particular reason, except that it suited him. By the time James Henry was 8 months old, he had an opinion about everything and communicated it with vigor, and Rose carried him with her to the schoolhouse on occasion, where the older children competed for the privilege of minding him, and he watched the lessons from a padded basket with an alert black-eyed gaze that suggested he was absorbing considerably more than anyone gave him credit for. In 1887, their daughter arrived, Clara Alice Graves, named for Hector Donnelly's wife, who had been a steadfast friend to Rose since the beginning, and for Rose's Aunt Alice, who had kept her mother company through those difficult months. Clara was a serene baby where James had been a furious one, and she had Rose's sage-colored eyes from the very first day, which Clarence pointed out with a pride that was entirely disproportionate to his role in the matter, but which Rose allowed him because she found it charming. The Graves place grew. Clarence added to the herd steadily and carefully, not rushing, building the kind of operation that would last. And by 1888, he had taken on Armando Reyes as a hired hand, Armando having left the Donnelly spread to get married himself, to a woman named Lucia from San Angelo, and needing work that would let him be home in the evenings. Armando was as good a hand as Clarence had expected he would be, and better company than he had previously shown at the Donnelly place, and Lucia and Rose became friends with the particular swiftness that women sometimes achieve when they recognize in each other someone who is both capable and not competing. Rose taught at the Millhaven schoolhouse until 1889, when the school board expanded the school and hired an additional teacher, a young woman from Dallas named Frances, who had ideas about modern educational methods that she expressed with considerable energy. Rose and Frances disagreed about several things and agreed about many more, and the Millhaven School became, under their joint tenure, one of the better regarded schools in that part of Texas. On an October evening in 1889, 7 years after Rose Hawkins had stepped off a stagecoach into the bright Texas noon and Clarence Graves had lost the ability to think clearly, they sat on the east-facing porch of the limestone house in the cooling evening air. The live oaks were at their autumn best, the light slanting gold through the leaves. James was inside doing his homework with the vocal reluctance of a 4-year-old who thought numbers were a personal insult directed at him. Clara was asleep upstairs, having gone down with the easy certainty of a child who trusts the world. Armando and Lucia had gone home an hour ago, and the Graves place was quiet in the good way that places are quiet when they are full of the right things. Rose had a book open on her lap but was not reading it. Clarence had his coffee and was doing what he often did in these evening hours, watching the way the last light moved across the land that was his now in the complete sense, paid off and settled and planted with the particular permanence that comes from years of work and intention. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Rose asked. "In the schoolhouse when you told me the truth about why you came?" "Sometimes," he said. "I was not surprised," she said. "I want you to know that. I had suspected it for several weeks." He looked at her. "Had you?" "The way you watched me when you thought I was not looking," she said, with the small, precise smile that he had been trying to earn since their first evening in the schoolhouse and had by now, through sustained effort and genuine love, become the expression most naturally directed at him. "And the way you actually knew the books very well and occasionally had to pretend you did not." "I thought I was more subtle than that," he said. "You were not remotely subtle," she said. "But you were genuine, which is considerably more valuable." He looked out at the October land and the live oaks and the creek catching the last light in its bends. "I would do it again," he said. "Exactly the same, every bit of it." "Good," she said. "So would I." Inside the house, James Henry Graves shouted something about arithmetic that conveyed his feelings on the subject with memorable clarity. Rose closed her book and stood from her chair with the fluid, purposeful motion that was simply how she moved, and she put her hand briefly on Clarence's shoulder as she passed him, the quick, warm pressure of it, and he put his hand over hers for a moment before she went inside. He sat on the porch in the fading October light, listening to Rose's voice inside the house, explaining numbers to their son with patient, loving authority, and the coyotes starting up somewhere east along the creek, and the live oaks settling into the evening. And he thought that a man who began a story by pretending to need help with his books had arrived, through the generous grace of honesty eventually applied, at something he would not trade for anything the wide Texas world could offer. The stars came out one by one above the limestone house and the live oaks and the 40 acres of good grass by the creek, and the light in the windows was warm and yellow, and from inside came the sound of Rose laughing at something James had said, and then James laughing too, and then the quieter sound of Clara waking and beginning to make the small investigative sounds of a baby taking stock of the evening. Clarence finished his coffee and stood and went inside to his family, and the door of the limestone house closed behind him, solid and true in its frame, and the Texas night settled over Millhaven and the Graves place, and all the country around it, with the vast and unhurried peace of a land that has been here long before the people walking it, and will be here long after, carrying in its soil and its creeks, and its wide October skies the accumulated weight of every life lived honestly upon it. And what Clarence Graves and Rose Hawkins had built together upon it, from one small deliberate deception and one larger and more lasting truth, was very good and very real, and it was theirs, and it held.